I realized that I should probably put socks on for this video, you know? Hello. This is kind of impromptu, but I wanted to talk a little bit about comic book movie adaptations. That is, people who have very strong opinions about how faithful you should be with comic book adaptations in cinema or TV or what have you. Because there seems to be a small group of people who are like very adamant that everything should unfold precisely how it did in the comics to the movies, which I think is absurd. Because one, when you make a movie and you change stuff from the original source material, oftentimes the details they change make it better. They elevate it from the original material. Look no further than the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I feel like the way they tackled Civil War was better handled than the way they tackled Civil War potentially in the book. A lot of the elements of the Dark Knight trilogy were handled better on screen than they were in the comics. A lot of the characters were more fleshed out. They had more mythos. They had more philosophy to them. Like Two-Face, for example, is a much more interesting character in the movie than he ever was in the comic books. But I was thinking about this interaction I had with a person in my local Indigo store, Chapters, and I was in the comic book section. I was in the graphic novel section, that is to say, and this guy was looking at Infinity Gauntlet, and he's like, "Man, this is a great book." I was like, "Yeah, no, it is. It's one of my favorite events in Marvel history." And he was saying, "It's like, oh, they screwed it up in the movies, though." And I humored him. I said, "Well, how so? How did they screw it up?" And he relayed to me his feelings that, like, because it wasn't precisely how it was in the book, that it was bad. Like, it was inherently bad because it wasn't the comic book. Personally, I think that the Infinity War movie and the Endgame films are infinitely better than the Infinity Gauntlet comic book. The character of Thanos has more pathos. He has a philosophy. He has a reason for doing what he does. In the comic books, it's because he's in love with Mr. Death, which is fine, but he was far more compelling a character than he was in the comic books in the movie. He had a pathos, he had a philosophy. You could see Thanos' point of view to some capacity. Some people might even go as far as to say Thanos was somewhat justified in what he did. Now, I don't agree with that. I think Thanos is a monster. But there is a point of view there that can potentially be seen. Whereas in the comic books, he is just like, I love death for death's sake. So that's, first of all, that's like a really important difference, a really important change to make in an adaptation. Because if you have a character who's as shallow as Thanos is in that storyline, that is to say, she's 1 through 6 of Infinity Gauntlet, he really doesn't have much pathos. He doesn't have much that makes him interesting, other than the fact that he's a badass, which is fine. But if you're going to make 2 movies out of that character as the villain, at minimum, because he was in Guardians of the Galaxy as well, but if you're going to make 2 Avengers films, 2 of the biggest films in the world, with that as your villain, you better be damn sure it's a good villain. And that's what they did. They made him a better villain than he ever was in the comic book Infinity stories. And I appreciate that. Another thing is, I don't want to know what happens in a movie before I see it. I want to be surprised. In a property, in an IP like the Marvel Cinematic Universe or the DC Expanded Universe, these are inherently IPs where you can tell different stories and still be faithful to the characters. Because the difference is, if you're adapting, say, like a novel, if you're adapting George Orwell's 1984 or something like that. That's a really specific piece of material on which to draw. However, in the comic book landscape, you have this vast multiverse of slight variations of events. You have this multiverse of characters and storylines where things do unfold differently, and that's what makes them interesting. If things unfolded the same in every universe, there wouldn't be any reason to acknowledge a multiverse. There wouldn't be any reason to play with that idea. But the fact that we're given an opportunity to take these characters and take these stories from comics and adapt them in a different universe with maybe even a slightly different set of characters, I think that's an opportunity that's very special and very unique to comic books. If you did that with a novel, if you did that with Animal Farm, I don't know. I keep going back to the Orwell. Well, um, if you did that with a novel, though, you would not be received with the same light as if you did that with comic books. There's more wiggle room to have fun and to make things interesting and new and fresh and different with comic books. Because comic books are a visual medium anyway. If I want to see Infinity Gauntlet exactly as it played out in Infinity Gauntlet, I would walk over to my shelf and grab my copy of Infinity Gauntlet. But instead, I got to see something that was interesting, new, different, and in my opinion, better than the original story. I got to see what was basically a 6-hour epic in these two films, based off of the concepts and material introduced in those books. So that's my 2 cents on the matter. That's how I feel about the whole situation. Let me know what your opinions are. One of my absolute favorite things about making YouTube videos is going down into the comment section and reading comments, and I reply to every comment, and I love the back and forth. I have a very talkative audience, as it would seem. So I appreciate your viewing. I appreciate your criticism as much as I appreciate your support and your ideas. So please subscribe, please. I haven't any food to eat. Help me.